Chapter 1 To deal with a thinker is to deal with his or her work. This may seem an obvious point, but, in fact, it is not. For example, in order to consider Marx, one should intensively read Capital. But people instead pass through certain external ideologies such as historical materialism or dialectical materialism, and merely read Capital in order to confirm these ideological presuppositions. This is not reading. What I mean by reading a work is, rather, to read neither with a presupposition of philosophies external to the work itself nor authorial intention. Capital, a critique of political economy, is already widely considered a classic in the history of political economy. This indicates two things. On the one hand, it suggests that Capital itself, along with the conceptual world and knowledge that it examines, is antiquated and out of date. On the other hand, as with the experience of reading Epicurus or Spinoza, reading the classics is precisely already an experience of ignoring all external appearances, and, instead, reading toward the center of possibility contained in the text. In his letter of May 31, 1858 to Ferdinand Lassalle, Marx states the following: "During this time of tribulation I carefully perused your Heraclitus. Your reconstruction of the system from the scattered fragments I regard as brilliant, nor was I any less impressed by the perspicacity of your polemic. I am all the more aware of the difficulties you had to surmount in this work, and that about 18 years ago I myself attempted a similar work on a far easier philosopher, Epicurus, namely the portrayal of a complete system from fragments, a system which I am convinced, by the by, was, as with Heraclitus, only implicitly present in his work, not consciously as a system. Even in the case of philosophers who give systematic form to their work, Spinoza for instance, the true inner structure of the system is quite unlike the form in which it was consciously presented by him." Marx's insight is by no means applicable solely to thinkers of the past. What he accomplished in his work on Capital was precisely a critique of the conscious systematization of capitalist society, classical political economy, and a simultaneous illumination of the inner structure of the capitalist mode of production. We might say that, behind this belief of Marx's, lay a certain sense that no one else had yet conceived of the problem in quite this way. But we will take up this problem at a later moment. What we must emphasize for now is the fact that the above words of Marx are equally applicable to his own work. As he states, it is meaningless to distinguish a given thinker's work in terms of its appearance of systematicity or fragmentation. All anti-systematic thinkers are systematic in an internal sense, and if not, are not essential thinkers, that is, they do not think radically, at the root of things. Let us take, for example, someone like Montaigne, who is seen as a representative anti-systematic thinker. We cannot unify and consolidate all that Montaigne states. In his thought there is an Epicurean moment, a Stoic moment, and a sort of Pascalian Christianity, yet he never gives the impression of a mere jumble of influences. If we are to read the essays carefully, we find that a kind of principle resides there, or a function of the spirit that appears as a principle. What never ceases to remain fresh in the essays is not its anti-systematicity or its tendency towards contradiction, but, rather, the fact that at its base is Montaigne's attempt to view every contradiction with new eyes. Thus, the fragmentary form of his thought is rather like a continuous protest against a transparent meaning, a meaning that would exceed the text. He states as follows: "I propose a life ordinary and without luster, 'tis all one. All moral philosophy may as well be applied to a common and private life, as to one of richer composition. Every man carries the entire form of the human condition. authors communicate themselves to the people by some special and extrinsic mark, I, the first of any, by my universal being, as Michel de Montaigne, not as a grammarian, a poet, or a lawyer. If the world find fault that I speak too much of myself, I find fault that they do not so much as think of themselves. To this is an ironic statement. In fact, Montaigne is neither writing nor thinking of his so-called self at all. Rather, he states, the people only think of themselves. When Montaigne says, I, the first of any, he is speaking of the first discovery of the conviction that this thing called I or the self can become the subject. In contrast to authors up to this point, Montaigne is simply saying, you all, as philosophers and poets, may speak of the human being, of the spirit, and so on, but in fact you are not yet speaking of anything at all. I'm tired of all explanation, determination, interpretation. I will instead speak, with neither presupposition nor hesitation, of this absolutely commonplace, yet strange and mysterious thing called I. What Montaigne here depicts is not a series of former ideas concerning the human, but rather what we might call its inner structure. All ideas of the human are destroyed by Montaigne. But this was no threat to him, because he fundamentally believes that the figure of the human discovered by religion and philosophy is merely the signified, and at its base is the strange signifier of the I. In other words, for Montaigne there is an I that is neither the subject nor self-consciousness, but, conversely, is the source from which these emerge. This is not the so-called self, but rather the very text he quotes. Marx writes as follows in the first edition of Capital, a commodity seems at first glance to be a self-evident, trivial thing. The analysis of it yields the insight that it is a very vexatious thing, full of metaphysical subtlety and theological perversities. 3 previous political economists had already formulated the system of political economy on the basis of categorical arrangements derived from what existed before their eyes. It is possible to say that Marx inherited these various categories and critically reconstructed them, but the capacity to see the most simple and commonplace commodity as full of metaphysical subtlety and theological perversities was in no way already an aspect of the existing political economy. All economists, and economists in particular, merely passed through this simple thing as if it were self-evident. As Shakespeare demonstrates in Timon of Athens, money is a monster that can possess or transform anything. Moreover, we all know that capital, in the form of interest-bearing capital, is a monster capable of self-expansion. But Marx begins from the commodity, from this self-evident, trivial thing. He does not do so for convenience of description. In the Hegelian system, what is immediate is merely abstract and insubstantial. But, in Capital, the mysteriousness of this most simple of commodities is that, while it is continuous at all levels of description, its form, as it were, changes and expands as it proceeds. The earlier terms are the key to the entirety. What distinguishes the brilliance of Capital as a text is not that it discloses the mystery of capitalist production, but, rather, Marx's own surprise at the very vexatious characteristics of this banal and simple commodity. At a glance, the commodity is a product and a variety of use values, but, if examined in greater depth, it is an ideational form that acts in excess of human volition precisely to restrict or constrain human beings, a form into which everything is enclosed. The established system of political economy was demolished by Marx's view of the simple and banal commodity as something vexatious. And in this sense, it is precisely Marx who first discovered the commodity, and thereby the form of value. 2. It was Engels who formulated Marxism as a system, and he was literally the first reader and interpreter of Marx's texts. The problem is that he was, in a sense, an outstanding thinker with qualities entirely different from those of Marx himself. It is incorrect to suggest that Engels distorted the true Marx. It is not excessive to say that, without Engels's genius, Marxism would never have enjoyed such mythical, religious power. This is analogous to the fact it was St. Paul who created Christianity. It was Paul who reinterpreted the death of Jesus, and Jesus himself can in no way be considered the creator of the Christian religion. The bulk of the force of influence that Marxism possesses does not in reality stem from Marx's texts, but, rather, exhausts his texts, stemming, instead, from a system of signification in which it appears that the texts merely express one limited aspect. No matter how much its mode of expression attempts to demarcate itself, this system of signification was born from the genealogy of Western thought, of Christianity and Platonism. Insofar as we read Marx's texts within this space, we will be unable to discover a form that fundamentally dissents from this genealogy itself. The problem, then, is not simply to subject this or that dogma to critique. All dogma always reduces the text as fragment to something transparent, a signification as totality. Marx, too, begins by reading texts. His uniqueness lies not in his establishment of a philosophical system but in his attitude towards the text, and his fidelity to this attitude. Capital is Marx's reading of the texts of classical political economy, nothing more, nothing less. In other words, it is a mistake to seek Marx's thought anywhere other than in his own mode of reading. Or, perhaps, we could say the following: Marx's thought is precisely his method of reading itself. We can discover this already in his 1841 doctoral thesis, The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature. It goes without saying that, at the time, Marx was simply one amongst a number of young, left-wing Hegelians. In terms of vocabulary, in terms of the system of signification, he belonged fully to the Hegelian left. But, when we examine Marx from the standpoint of capital, what is crucial is not located in his spectacular inversion of Hegel's philosophy, but in his objection to a certain specific portion of Hegel's history of philosophy, the point at which Marx set out on a path no one had yet taken. What we must pay particular attention to is the fact that Marx did not read the ancient materialist Epicurus simply as one unitary system of signification, nor did he attempt to examine simply the general differences between Epicurus and Democritus. His investigation is precisely delimited, the difference between the Democritean and Epicurean philosophy of nature. Up to this point, in the accepted wisdom of the history of philosophy, the two thinkers' understanding of physics had been treated as largely the same, and it had been generally understood that Epicurus simply borrowed from Democritean physics, with his few minor alterations amounting to no more than arbitrary steps backward. For example, although Democritus believed that the movement of atoms was necessary and determinate, Epicurus saw in this movement contingency, swerving, and deviation. This difference between the two could be seen as prefiguring our contemporary theories of uncertainty, but prior to Marx's emphasis on this point, the difference was seen as largely meaningless. Of course, Marx did not ascribe meaning to this point as a physicist. In Marx's view, Democritus attempted to grasp the natural world by means of determinism. Epicurus, on the other hand, emphasized divergence against determination, and precisely in this sense of divergence and deviation, laid the foundations that would give rise to theories of self-consciousness, of human subjectivity and freedom. This insight, even if we remove its genesis in the conceptual framework of the young Hegelians, contains a decisive and crucial understanding. rather than seeing human freedom and subjectivity as a priori presuppositions. Such a perspective attempts rather to locate them in the swerves or deviations of nature. For the Marx of the time, it was precisely his task to secure or guarantee these concepts of freedom and subjectivity, but already here we see a perspective in which this freedom and subjectivity are things forced into existence by nature's contingent swerve. We will extend this discussion later in the present work. What is most important for the time being is that Marx, rather than speaking of the entirety of Epicurean philosophy, considers it solely in terms of its difference with the Democritean philosophy of nature, and furthermore, speaks of a difference within what is seen as an identity. It is an old and entrenched prejudice to identify Democritean and Epicurean physics, so that Epicurus modifications are seen as only arbitrary vagaries. On the other hand, I am forced to go into what seem to be microscopic examinations as far as details are concerned. But precisely because this prejudice is as old as the history of philosophy, because the differences are so concealed that they can be discovered as it were only with a microscope, it will be all the more important if, despite the interdependence of Democritean and Epicurean physics, an essential difference extending to the smallest details can be demonstrated. What can be demonstrated in the small can even more easily be shown where the relations are considered in larger dimensions, while conversely very general considerations leave doubt whether the result will hold when applied to details. For what Marx emphasizes here is not merely the differences that exist between their philosophies or practices, but rather the microscopic difference between two philosophies of nature that closely resemble each other. In other words, Marx attempted to deconstruct the locus of identity itself that positioned Epicurus simply as an epigone of Democritus. The same thing can be said of capital. There, Marx inherits and continues the project of numerous aspects of classical political economy, and this is precisely why non-Marxist economists treat capital as itself representative of one variant of classical political economy. In a sense, they are correct. But, of course, Marx also differs from the classical political economists, although not in the sense often propounded by Marxists themselves. This is precisely because much of what passes under the name of Marx's thought is, in fact, merely derived from classical political economy or from Hegel. For example, when Marx utilizes concepts such as phenomenon and essence, Hegel, or labor time, Adam Smith, he necessarily enters into the framework of their thought. If one attempts to defend Marx on these levels, Marx becomes nothing more than an epigone of Hegel or Smith. What is crucial is that Marx's uniqueness lies not in his spaces of difference with his predecessors, but, rather, lies secretly within those aspects of his thought that appear to be identical to them. When we read Epicurus, Marx reminds us, we must overturn a prejudice as old as the history of philosophy 5. The form of identification that states Epicurus is Epicurus and Democritus is Democritus is itself as old as the history of philosophy. But this is precisely what expresses the secret of philosophy. Why? Because philosophy is always emerging at the very point at which it conceals the text as fragment, in other words, the text itself as signifier. In the history of philosophy, Epicurus is a concept. When Marx dismantles this concept, he himself is present at the site of the becoming of the concept itself. Nietzsche writes, "Let us still give special consideration to the formation of concepts." Every word immediately becomes a concept, inasmuch as it is not intended to serve as a reminder of the unique and wholly individualized original experience to which it owes its birth, but must at the same time fit innumerable, more or less similar cases, which means, strictly speaking, never equal, in other words, a lot of unequal cases. Every concept originates through or equating what is unequal. No leaf ever wholly equals another, and the concept leaf is formed through an arbitrary abstraction from these individual differences, through forgetting the distinctions, and now it gives rise to the idea that in nature there might be something besides the leaves which would be leaf-some kind of original form after which all leaves have been woven, marked, copied, colored, curled, and painted, but by unskilled hands, so that no copy turned out to be a correct, reliable, and faithful image of the original form. 6. For Marx, the task is to discover not this Epicurus as original form, but as difference. If philosophical truth is located in metaphors worn out from frequent use, Nietzsche, then, in an inverse sense, in order to truly think, we must think with new metaphors. At the point wherein historically accumulated rigor is derided, philosophy is fundamentally shaken. 3. Thus, what we should pay particular attention to in the doctoral thesis is Marx's method of reading outlined above, along with the fact that he himself reconfirmed this reading strategy during the process of work on the critique of political economy. For example, in the preface to the first edition of Capital, we can even see an identical phrasing, the value form, whose fully developed shape is the money form, is very elementary and simple. Nevertheless, the human mind has for more than 2,000 years sought in vain to get to the bottom of it, whilst on the other hand, to the successful analysis of much more composite and complex forms, there has been at least an approximation. Why? Because the body, as an organic whole, is more easy of study than are the cells of that body. In the analysis of economic forms, moreover, neither microscopes nor chemical reagents are of use. The force of abstraction must replace both. But in bourgeois society the commodity form of the product of labor, or the value form of the commodity, is the economic cell form. To the superficial observer, the analysis of these forms seems to turn upon minutiae. It does in fact deal with minutiae, but they are of the same order as those dealt with in microscopic anatomy. 7. We might also put this as follows: prejudiced views of money or indeed value are as old as the history of political economy itself. On a broader level, classical political economy basically succeeded in elucidating the nature of economic phenomena, but in its minutiae, that is, in relation to the theory of the value form, was unable to achieve anything of note. The principal task of Marx's Capital is to overthrow the prejudices and distortions of political economy or monetary economics, prejudices as old as the discipline itself or indeed the money economy, precisely through a microscopic explication of the value form. Yet, the microscopic detail here concerns the enigma of the money form, exactly the moment within which we can identify Marx's difference from both classical political economy and from Hegel. Certainly, the totality of Capital appears to form a dialectical narrative. However, if we read this text for its minutiae, it is in the theory of the value form that Marx reveals to us the inversive nature of the dialectic, and it is not reducible to the famous imperative to place back on its feet the Hegelian dialectic that is standing on its head. Obviously, Marx does not say this explicitly. On the contrary, he goes so far as to openly avow himself a pupil of that mighty thinker. Yet, precisely at this moment, he is paradoxically free from Hegel. Marx's thought, grappling with the narrative depiction of the theory of the value form, or the very vexatious thing that is the commodity, is not merely something that inverted the Hegelian dialectic. Certainly, at first glance, the theory of the value form appears to simply be a means of proving the necessity of money. But the Hegelian-style development of the self-realization of money notwithstanding, What Marx states is that the emergence of money conceals or covers over the commodity or the form of value. If there is in Marx a critique of Hegel, it exists precisely at the point in his thought where he speaks in Hegelian terms. In other words, it is in the microscopic differences, in the details, in the minor alterations, not in the fundamental inversion. I have already mentioned the question of what Marx meant by reading, but it is just the same for our own reading of Marx. We will not take account here of the numerous places in which Marx directly criticizes Hegel. What we should read instead are the places in which he does nothing of the kind, or even those in which he speaks in certain paraphrases of Hegel. But, in order to read in this manner, we must eliminate the disciplinary division of Marx's works that treats capital as a text in political economy, the German ideology as a text of philosophy, and so on. The identity of individual disciplines, stemming from their mutual differentiation, conceals the fact that they are linked together by metaphorical analogy. What allows us to strip away this concealment is the act of reading metaphorically. In other words, it is crucial to read with a view to once again restoring a certain arbitrariness to what appear to be completed, foreclosed, and fixed relations. This would mean to discover in reading, as Marx does, the text as fragment, the text that is irreducible to a transparent system of signification. Needless to say, the theory of the value form is precisely such a text. I do not think the efforts of political economists and philosophers to lend logical coherence to this theoretical work are futile. Rather, I want to read in this moment towards the origin of the logical itself. Heidegger writes, "The greater the work of a thinker, which in no way coincides with the breadth and number of writings, the richer is what is unthought in this work, which means, that which emerges in and through this work as having not yet been thought." 8. The richness of the theory of the value form consists in the advent of what has not yet been thought within it. Insofar as every author writes within a language and a logic, every author possesses a unique system. But the richness of a work exists insofar as there is a system that the author cannot control within the systematic structure that the author is consciously in control of, precisely in the sense that Marx expresses in his letter to La Salle above. To read Marx is to read what is unthought in the theory of the value form. In essence, I do not intend to read Marx beyond this point. The object of this study is to read Marx in the center of his possibilities. Chapter 2:1 Marx speaks of the enigmatic nature of the commodity, and this is where we too must begin. Everyone knows what a commodity is, but unless we cast doubt on this knowledge, we will be unable to see the enigma of the commodity. For example, in contrast to those orthodox Marxists who wave around copies of Capital, the literary critic Kobayashi Hideo once wrote,